Welcome, traveler. Come, take a seat by the fire, let the gentle warmth chase away the chill of your long journey. Listen to the crackle of the logs, the soft sigh of embers as they whisper ancient secrets. Here, in this quiet circle of light, we leave the weight of the world at the door. If you find comfort in stories like these, consider joining us on more journeys. Your support helps keep the fire burning bright. Now, sit back, let your mind wander, and simply enjoy. Tonight, as the flames dance and cast their tender glow on old stones, we drift to distant ages, where marble temples gleamed under open skies, and prayers for courage rose into the wind. It is there we meet Ares, not merely the god of war, but the restless spirit of conflict woven through every human heart. By this humble hearth, we explore his legend softly, seeking not the clamour of battle, but the deeper lessons waiting in his shadow. High above mortal fields, beyond drifting mists and the patient climb of ancient pines, stood Olympus, a realm of shining marble, perfumed gardens, and halls that sang softly with every breath of the wind. Here the gods moved with quiet authority, their laughter trailing like silver ribbons through groves untouched by time. It was in this sanctuary of brilliance and delicate balance that Ares took his first breath. Born of Zeus and Hera, sovereigns who held the sky and the bonds of hearth in their hands. Ares was not a child born into gentle hopes. Some tales whisper he was conceived in Hera's defiance, a son to stand unchallenged among all the offspring of Zeus. Others tell of a rare, fervent union between king and queen, their mingled powers igniting a spark that would grow into something the cosmos itself would learn to watch with wary eyes. From the moment his cries echoed through Olympus, they carried an edge sharper than any other infant's wail. The columns quivered, fountains splashed over carved basins, and the bright air seemed to tighten, holding its breath. Down upon the slopes, shepherds looked up, their hands tightening around crooks, a chill ghosting across sun-warmed skin, though no storm gathered. Even then, the world seemed to recognize that a new force had entered its story, one that could not be contained by gentle lullabies or tender smiles. As Ares grew, this restless nature only deepened. He was drawn to contests, not for sport, but from a need that burned hot within his chest. Other young gods would spar in playful bouts. With Ares, each match became a proving ground, his laughter fierce, his victories edged with something more than mere delight. Even as a boy, his eyes held the fever of battles yet to come, and the ground beneath his feet sometimes trembled faintly, as though uneasy to bear his weight. Among his divine kin, whispers began to rise. Athena, who would craft strategies with calm precision, watched her half-brother's reckless passions with a calculating gaze. Zeus, for all his might, seemed at times almost contemplative, as though wondering what havoc his blood had seeded. Hera alone wore a look that hovered between pride and apprehension, knowing full well that in creating Ares, she had shaped not merely a son, but a storm waiting for its hour. Thus did Ares come into being, not nurtured toward careful wisdom, but urged ever onward by a fire woven into the marrow of his bones. Even before he first set foot upon mortal soil, he cast a long shadow down the mountainside, a promise that the world would one day learn to speak his name with both reverence and dread. And so we find the beginnings of a tale that will soon wind through the sunlit hills of Greece, where his true presence would take root among men's fears and fragile hopes alike. Yet for all the thunder of his war cries and the iron scent of blood that seemed to follow in his wake, Ares' story would not be whole without the tender and curiously fragile thread that bound him to Aphrodite. In the hush of many nights, far from the clamour of shields striking shields, the god of war was drawn again and again to the goddess of love, whose laughter could soften even the most battle-hardened heart. Their union was at once inevitable and fraught. For what is love if not a battlefield of its own? Aphrodite's beauty was said to dazzle even the sun, her very presence stirring longings that mortal poets could barely put to verse. Ares, ever governed by impulse and desire, was helpless before her. In Aphrodite's arms, the storm within him seemed to quiet, if only for a time, like a blade laid aside to cool. But Olympus was never a place free of jealous eyes or quiet schemes. Hephaestus, Aphrodite's husband, was a god of forge and craft, patient and cunning, where Ares was rash and brazen. Discovering their secret trysts, he wove a trap of the finest, thinnest chains, so delicate they could not be seen, yet so strong no god could break them once caught. One golden afternoon, as Ares and Aphrodite lay entwined upon a bed that seemed spun from the first blush of dawn, the net sprang tight around them. Laughter soon filled the hall, for Hephaestus called the other gods to witness the captured lovers. Apollo and Hermes jested. Athena only watched with her cool, knowing eyes. And even Zeus, ruler of all, allowed a weary smile at the folly of passion unchecked. Yet beneath the laughter lay something older, something almost mournful, for love and conflict have forever been bound together, each giving rise to the other in endless, circling dance. In Aphrodite, Ares found not just pleasure, but the tender ache that made all his furious battles meaningful. And in Ares, Aphrodite tasted the fierce protectiveness that turns longing into devotion. Thus, their story slipped quietly into the human heart. Lovers quarrelling under olive trees, soldiers carving tokens for sweethearts left behind. Each played out small echoes of this divine entanglement. It reminded mortals that no force stands truly apart. Love may bind what war would tear, just as passion may ignite flames that smoulder into lasting scars. So did Ares and Aphrodite become not merely a scandal on Olympus, but a living parable of how deeply entwined our gentlest and most violent instincts truly are. When Ares stepped onto the battlefield, the very air seemed to tighten, as if the world itself drew a sharp breath. Grass bowed low, dust swirled up in uneasy spirals, and even the sun's clear light sometimes dimmed behind a thin veil of trembling clouds. This was his true domain, not the quiet chambers of lovers or the hushed offerings at lonely shrines, but the open fields, where men tested fate with steel and courage. Unlike Athena, who guided generals with clever schemes and patient maneuvering, Ares delighted in the raw heart of combat. He was the surge of blood that made soldiers roar, the wild thunder of hooves bearing riders into the fray. Where he strode, shields splintered beneath hammering blows, spear points flashed like sudden stars, and war cries rose high enough to seem almost joyful, a terrible, exultant music that needed no harp. Poets tried to capture this frenzy, describing Ares as a tempest wrapped in bronze. Homer spoke of him charging through ranks like a towering flame, his laughter mingling with screams and the ringing of struck iron. Even the bravest felt a coldness at their backs, when they sensed his unseen gaze, for Ares cared little who fell or triumphed. His joy lay in the contest itself, in the chaotic rush that stripped men bare of pretense and laid their souls open to judgment by fear and ferocity. Yet his presence was not all bright clamour and clashing arms. Beneath the din lurked a sobering truth. For each warrior who stood firm with shining eyes, another faltered, crushed beneath the weight of terror Ares brought in his wake. Mothers wept in quiet homes, children grew up beside empty doorways. In these silent spaces, the cost of his exultation became clear. A shadow long and dark that trailed each of his bloody triumphs. And so the Greeks both revered and recoiled from him. They understood that Ares was not merely a bringer of ruin, but a force revealing the fragile line between valor and savagery. In his wake bloomed stories of men who rose above fear, or sank beneath it, never to be the same. Thus did Ares become a crucible, forging destinies in heat and noise, reminding mortals that courage is tested not in times of peace, but when the earth itself seems to tremble beneath war's relentless tread. Though Ares' bronze-clad form might stride upon open fields, his truest dominion lay much closer, within the silent chambers of every human heart. For it is there, in the restless dark where secret fears and hungers dwell, that his spirit found its deepest stronghold. Long after armies had withdrawn and blood had dried on sun-hardened soil, the whisper of Ares remained. It stirred in sudden anger that flared over trivial slights, in jealous thoughts that coiled tight and hot, in that cold thrill some felt when victory came at another's cost. Even in the smallest village, far from grand campaigns and rallying banners, people carried within them a spark of the same fire that lit Ares' eyes. Ancient philosophers sometimes spoke of this with wary respect. They argued that to deny such impulses entirely was folly, for without them courage could not exist. Who would defend home or kin without a flame to drive them forward, to stand firm when shadows crept close? Yet these same sages warned that the line between rightful defense and reckless violence was perilously thin, and often blurred by pride or pain. In crossing it, mortals did not just risk ruin upon their neighbors, but lost something of themselves in the bargain. Artists, too, seemed to understand this quiet dominion. In carvings on humble stone and delicate paintings upon clay, Ares sometimes appeared not in full battle glory, but as a darker echo behind heroic deeds. A subtle glance, a tightening hand on a spear, a face turned partly away as though wrestling with thoughts too heavy to share. These small details hinted that war was never merely a clash of swords. It began always in the secret places where envy, ambition, and fear took root. So did Ares walk with all people, unseen but felt, a silent companion to moments of rash decision and unchecked wrath. In this way, he was not only a god above, demanding sacrifices or exulting in chaos, but a reflection of something old and unsettled inside each beating heart. And perhaps it was this truth the Greeks understood most keenly, that in telling stories of Ares, they were also telling stories of themselves, mapping the uneasy territories of their own souls where love, honor, terror, and rage lay tangled in restless sleep. As generations passed, and Greece grew from scattered villages into proud city-states crowned by marble columns, thinkers began to wrestle more openly with the unsettling figure of Ares. In cool courtyards shaded by vines, philosophers debated his worth. Many saw in him little but a reckless force, a god who gloried in suffering, indifferent to whether the fallen were noble or base. Compared to Athena, who guided rulers with quiet wisdom and preserved countless lives through careful planning, Ares seemed almost a shameful stain upon Olympus, a reminder of darker instincts the divine family could not wholly deny. Yet others argued differently. They saw in Ares a necessity that polite society preferred to overlook. When distant watchfires flared along ridges, signaling that raiders had come, it was not Athena's diagrams of supply lines or flanking maneuvers that first moved villagers to action. It was Ares, or rather, that fierce ember he represented within every human breast. His spirit poured like molten metal into the hearts of farmers and tradesmen, stiffening their resolve so they could grip spear and shield despite trembling limbs. In those tense moments, he was not merely a bringer of death, but the raw force that made them stand together when all seemed lost. Around small hearths, older men recounted their own youth with lowered voices, speaking of nights when fear was so thick it seemed to settle on their skin like cold dew. They told how the beat of their hearts quickened until it felt almost joyful, how the taste of iron filled their mouths as if anticipating blood. In those memories, Ares was not some distant god to be scorned, but a presence that had walked beside them, lending courage they scarcely believed they possessed. Even humble potters and painters seemed to capture this dual nature. On many vessels, Ares appeared not simply as a marauder crashing through lines of hapless soldiers, but as a towering figure behind men who stood firm, their faces strained with the terrible beauty of choosing to fight. His shadow fell over them like a dark mantle, frightening yet also strangely protective. Thus, Ares' reputation wove itself into something more tangled than mere condemnation. He was at once destroyer and necessary guardian, the harsh truth behind humanity's noblest stands and ugliest impulses alike. The Greeks understood that life could not be lived in gentle hues alone. shadow gave shape to light, just as the threat of ruin revealed the worth of fragile peace. So, while grand temples to Athena rose at city hearts, on quiet hills or by lonely trees, simple altars to Ares stood as well. Here, modest offerings were laid down, not out of affection, but from a sober recognition that in a world forever balanced between hope and hazard, even the fiercest god might hold a place that could not be denied. As time wore on and the bright age of Greece gave way to Rome's vast ambitions, Ares did not vanish into forgotten dust. Instead, he crossed seas and languages, taking on new names and attributes among the legions that marched beneath crimson standards. In Rome, he was called Mars, a figure reshaped by different needs, yet still bearing the same core of restless might. Unlike in Greece, where Ares was often treated with caution, the Romans embraced Mars with open arms. They saw in him not only the bloodlust of pitched battle, but the steadfast force that safeguarded crops and shepherded the destiny of the state. Mars was honored as a father of the people, said to have sired Romulus and Remus, the legendary twins who nursed at a she-wolf's side and laid the first stones of Rome's mighty walls. This blending of war and fertility spoke to an older, almost primal truth, that conquest and prosperity were often two faces of the same stern god. Fields might blossom after armies had cleared new land. Roads and aqueducts might follow in the wake of iron ranks, carrying fresh water where none had flowed before. In Mars, the Romans found a patron who legitimized their hunger to expand, turning violent ambition into a civilizing mission that echoed through marble forums and crowded marketplaces. Yet for all his stately temples and public games, the shadow of the older Ares still clung quietly to Mars' polished armor. When Roman soldiers stood at the edges of dark forests or on distant riverbanks, gazing into lands whose people had never spoken Latin prayers, it was not Athena's calm logic that beat in their chests. It was the same old surge, the thundering pulse that had driven Greek hoplites across sun-scorched plains. The intimate whisper of fear and daring tangled together. Thus did Ares live on, disguised yet unchanged, carried in the breath of every legionary who tightened his grip on a gladius at dawn. Across borders drawn and redrawn by empire's hand, he remained that ancient spirit of conflict, reminding even Rome that beneath civic order and grand architecture lay something older and more volatile, the unquiet promise of strife that no law could ever fully tame. In this way, the god of war wandered far beyond olive groves and Hellenic hymns, finding new altars and new tongues to speak his name. Yet wherever he traveled, whether clad as Ares or Mars, he brought with him the same question humanity had always faced: how to balance the gifts of his fierce protection with the terrible costs his favor so often demanded. Even as centuries flowed onward and old temples crumbled beneath ivy and rain, the symbols of Ares endured, etched deep into the bones of human culture. His spear and shield, his crested helm and snarling warhounds were not left behind with broken statues. They traveled quietly through time, carried in banners, stories, and in the guarded hearts of those who still walked roads once paved by empire. On medieval shields and over castle gates, echoes of Ares' insignia reappeared, though cloaked in new heraldry. Across distant continents, drums beat in patterns that stirred the same primal urgency he had once delighted in. Even in ages that prided themselves on reason and law, parades of soldiers marched under standards adorned with swords and eagles, their bright metal catching the sun just as bronze once did in dusty Greek valleys. These images held a curious duality. They spoke of protection, of valor marshaled to defend fragile homes and tender bonds. Yet they also carried an unspoken threat, a reminder that might, once raised, did not always bow obediently to conscience. For each emblem stitched to honor sacrifice, there lay a darker promise, that war could rise again, swift and eager at the faintest provocation. Artists seem to understand this tension instinctively. On countless canvases and carved reliefs, warriors bore expressions both fierce and haunted, as though aware of standing upon a knife's edge between necessary defense and needless ruin. Ares' old companions, the hounds that raced beside his chariot, the burning torches he sometimes wielded, found quiet rebirth in countless depictions of battle across cultures, subtle nods to the same restless deity by other names. And so the legacy of Ares was not confined to dusty myths or fragile pottery displayed behind museum glass. It lived on wherever humanity gathered its courage to protect, or allowed ambition to sharpen into conquest. His symbols adorned coins, standards, and even the words of laws meant to regulate the very violence he inspired. In this, Ares remained ever close, not simply as a relic of forgotten rites, but as an enduring presence that haunted the space between noble cause and dark appetite. Each spear carved on a monument, each crest on a soldier's helm, was a quiet admission that his old lessons, both their grim weight and their harsh necessity, had never truly left our hands. All the glory woven into tales of conquest and banners lifted high against stormy skies, the deepest lessons Ares offered were often not about triumph at all, but about the stark cost of letting wrath rule unchecked. Across generations, stories of proud kings brought low by arrogance, of champions who chased glory too far and found only ruin, grew into quiet parables whispered beside hearths long after trumpets had fallen silent. Greek tragedians understood this well. They penned plays where mighty warriors, swollen with the favor of Ares, pressed beyond the bounds of prudence, only to see their worlds collapse. It was not merely fate or the jealousy of rival gods that undid them, but the seed of violence sown too freely, watered by pride and fear until it blossomed into devastation none could control. In these somber stories lay a warning meant not just for heroes or rulers, but for any soul quick to anger. Ares revealed the double edge of courage, that valor without wisdom turns swiftly to cruelty, and strength untempered by compassion may carve deep scars not only on the land, but within the spirit. For each tale of cities saved by brave defenders stood another of innocents trampled underfoot, their homes left smouldering in wars waged for petty grudges or hollow boasts. And so, across Greece, and later wherever his name traveled, cloaked as Mars or countless other war gods, people learned to offer sacrifices to Ares, not to invite his favor recklessly, but often to appease him, to beg that his hands stay idle unless absolutely needed. His altars bore not the carefree garlands draped over shrines to love or wine, but darker tokens, weighted by solemn understanding of what his presence truly meant. In this way, Ares served as a grim teacher of balance. His myth reminded even the humblest shepherd that fury might defend the flock from wolves, yet if turned inward or loosed without thought, could lay waste to the very pasture meant to sustain them. Thus did mortals come to respect the fragile thread between defense and destruction, a lesson etched not only in marble friezes and ancient verse, but in the tender caution with which parents raise sons who might one day take up the spear. Long after sacrifices ceased to smoulder on stone altars and priests no longer lifted prayers in Ares' name, his spirit lingered, like a faint vibration carried through the bones of the earth. Across ages that fancied themselves wiser and more civilized, people still found themselves drawn to his old allure, and just as often recoiled from the shadow he cast. In every rivalry, whether merchants haggled over docks or nobles schemed in dimly lit halls, a trace of Ares' restless pulse could be felt. When disputes flared from sharp words into clenched fists, or when neighbors eyed each other's fields with envy that soured into threat, it was as though the god of war paused to watch, curious to see if his old fire might catch once more. History itself bore witness to how easily that spark could be fanned into flame. From marching legions on foreign roads to the rattle of muskets on fog-laced battlefields, Ares' echo threaded through the centuries. Even the poets who sang of honor and the solemn gravestones that dotted quiet churchyards told the same story in their own hushed ways, that humanity's struggle with conflict had never truly ended. Yet there was also a growing wisdom, hard won through loss. In time, councils met not merely to divide spoils, but to draft fragile treaties. Leaders gathered beneath banners of parley, hoping to spare their people the sorrow written so often in Ares' wake. Families who had once gloried in sending sons off to war began to count the cost more carefully, hearts heavy with knowledge that victory could taste bitter when measured against empty chairs at supper tables. In this way, Ares remained close, not as a god openly invoked, but as a silent question that haunted each choice where pride might press against compassion. Was this quarrel worth the toll it could demand? Would courage here build a safer future, or shatter what little peace had been so painstakingly woven? Thus did the old god's presence endure, a restless murmur at the edge of conscience, no longer crowned in bright festivals or led through streets with garlands. Ares walked beside humanity still, pressing each generation to reckon anew with the delicate balance between rightful defense and the devastation born of wrath left unbridled. And so, as countless suns have set beyond ruined temples and silent battlefields, we might imagine Ares himself wandering those forgotten places. No longer does he stride as a radiant force clad in bronze, spear lifted high amid roars of triumph. Instead, he moves quietly among moss-clad stones and grasses swaying in gentle evening winds, his once fierce gaze softened by the long passage of time. Perhaps he pauses beside a weathered column, trailing fingers across grooves carved by hands that offered both prayers and pleas. In that hush, Ares seems less a harbinger of ruin and more a keeper of memories, of shouts that once shook the air, of tears shed over lifeless forms, of fragile hopes that somehow endured even under the shadow of his name. In this twilight, the god of war becomes almost contemplative. His armor bears the subtle dents of countless clashes, dulled now to a somber sheen that reflects not the blaze of conquest, but the muted glow of dying embers. The hounds that once raced joyously at his heels lie resting in the tall grass, their watchful eyes no longer fixed on distant foes, but half closed in wary peace. Here Ares stands as a reminder not only of what was lost through countless struggles, but of how humanity has slowly learned, painfully, imperfectly, to weigh the costs of its own tempests. He becomes a figure woven of both caution and quiet testimony, urging us to remember the scars left behind whenever fury was chosen over mercy, whenever pride drowned out gentle counsel. And so, as we sit again by our own modest hearth, with flames dancing low and soft shadows playing upon the walls, Ares' long tail draws near to ours. No longer just a god of clamorous battles, he stands as a mirror to our deepest conflicts, a silent witness to the hard wisdom each generation must earn anew. In that tender hush, we come to see that even the fiercest war god might carry lessons meant not to glorify strife, but to teach us, at last, the true worth of peace. So, our quiet journey with Ares draws to a close. Here, by the fire's gentle glow, his story lingers not as a celebration of strife, but as a tender lesson on the fragile balance between courage and cruelty, pride and mercy. In his long shadow, we glimpse our own restless hearts, forever choosing between the urge to conquer and the wisdom to protect. If these calm explorations speak to you, if you'd like to wander through more timeless myths by the hearth, your support helps keep this humble fire burning. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe so you can join us again for the next story.